For all the many people, especially poets of past and present, that you will hear me reference in our time together, especially in messages like this, one name that you will probably not hear very often is Leonard Sweet. And that is not a personal slight, so much as I realized through some of his books on my shelves that there are more than a few points in his work where I'd say I'd want to share it with a few qualifiers. We sit a little bit apart on the theology spectrum, and that's more than okay. He still offers some really crucial wisdom on plenty of things, so much so that I've kept those books on my shelves. Long ago, I printed out a goal, a summary goal that he once offered to those who are receiving his preaching. And I have kept that in hard copy and brought it with me here again and placed it near my workspace to try to hold me to that goal too. So he said, I want to preach so that you carry not my words in your head, but you carry around with you Jesus' stories and metaphors in your mind and heart. So as your minister here in this place, I want to preach so that you carry around with you God's glorious and ever unfolding story in your mind and heart, knowing that you are not just a central character, you are the very reason for the story. We are all together who God had in mind with every word of love and new life for all of creation. The story that we're hearing and thinking through today is not that deep into the book of Acts, but it's far enough in that there are some pieces the author already presumes you've read from the beginning and you don't need that repeated. So for example, the book of Acts is usually considered Luke volume 2, and you get that sense as you read along from the beginning. There is a continuation, albeit with a much broader scope of the disciples' movement and their ministry. The primary disciple in these verses from Acts 9 is Peter. He's the one first called by Jesus and the one that has been renamed by Jesus. Simon was a Jewish fisherman, became known and named by Jesus as Peter, the rock, the one on whom Jesus would build a community. Scholars summarize and say much can be learned about Peter from the New Testament, either explicitly from the statements made by and about Peter, or indirectly from his actions and reactions as revealed in a number of episodes where he figures prominently. He was at times vacillating and unsure, such as relations with the church of Antioch when he first ate with the Gentiles, and then later on he refused to do so. Peter could be very resolute, which seems like a polite word. Occasionally he is depicted as rash and hasty, irritable, capable of great anger. Often he is pictured as gentle but firm, and as in his professions of love to Jesus, he's capable of really great loyalty of love, even if in the process he ends up making some pretty massive mistakes. So all along the way, Simon, who becomes Peter, is very, very human. By the time we meet up with Peter at Acts 9:36, he has been very, very busy in the sharing of Jesus' message. He preached at Pentecost, he testified before religious leaders in Jerusalem, he's exercised discipline in the early church, and he had been traveling what would have been considered extensively for that time and place through Samaria to Lydda, the plain of Sharon, and then he arrives at the Mediterranean coastal town of Joppa, where he offered healing to Tabitha. The fact that healing came from a man of two names to a woman with more than one moniker is coincidental, but it's kind of a fascinating point to stop and think for a minute. Peter's invitation, his call to come to Tabitha's city, brought him into the company of a woman who was often called by others Dorcas. One name is Aramaic, the other is Greek. There's also a Hebrew equivalent, Zibia. Throughout this passage from Acts, the writer moves back and forth in naming her from the Aramaic to the Greek and back again. Tabitha is Dorcas, is Tabitha. Hers was a very common name at that time in both languages. Her identity beyond that, unfortunately, is barely recorded in Acts. She may have been a widow or not. She may have been poor or not. She may have been a mother or not. We don't know any of those things for certain, but we are told she created beautiful garments and that her community, particularly the women around her, they were distraught at the news of her death. Above all, we know she was beloved by those around her and the God who called the man of two names to come and lift her back to life. Centuries later, both were lifted into reverence by the institutional expression of following Jesus, the church. Simon, who came to be called St. Peter, was with Tabitha, who came to be called St. Dorcas. And I sense that all of that last sentence would have come as quite a bit of a surprise to both of them. Their bond was seemingly forged in a place of fundamentals, not sainthood. It was about living and dying and trusting that there is life to come beyond our dying. The path by which we here have all come together is far less of a surprise, I would say, in some ways. This institutional expression of following Jesus has a process for minister and congregation, and through that, we have found one another. It's also a process of deep listening, of waiting, of wondering, praying, trusting, believing that we can get to this point of new beginning. Your welcome to me has been exceedingly gracious and kind and patient, knowing how much our family has been through since the middle of April in particular. You have given space for me to share as I feel comfortable, sometimes following my unpredictable stream of consciousness down an unusual number of rabbit holes. Many of you have learned already that I am a woman of a two-part surname, but beyond that, there are many singularities in my life. We have one son, one daughter. I have one brother. I have one spouse who has one sister. Together, we have one cat, and there is one other country for which I am known to feel homesick, and that is Scotland. I have one dominant color in my wardrobe, various shades of blue. I have one rather unholy obsession with scarves used to accessorize. I have one very green thumb. I have one very big passion for books, and I rarely listen to any radio stations beyond CBC Radio 1. I also have one big heart that resides right about there. That singularity starts to break down quickly when I identify the multi-layered church background of my life. Some spaces very, very different than what we know and live here. I have watched too closely what happens when only one viewpoint is allowed in the spiritual room. And so while I was not born into the United Church of Canada, I have spent, I'm quick math, I think I'm at about 41 of my 50 years and counting. And I am very, very at home in this place of multiplicity, unconditional welcome, and radical inclusion. So imagine my delight then at being paired with this new community that seeks to be just that and holding a history of more than one name. As you have listened to bits of my story this past week, and for the search team, much, much longer indeed, I've been privileged to listen to some of yours. We're still so very early in this process, but there's a deep gift in watching how and what you share about who you know yourselves to be. God has clearly been up to some really marvelous things in your individual lives and as a body of people, with so much more still to come. Along the way of that listening, I've noticed something about a tendency for some, not all, to identify with a place called Christ Church or a place called First United Church. And this doesn't surprise me, it doesn't alarm me, with the awareness that in the grander scheme, amalgamation is still very early in process. You've come through a whole lot in such a short time. For two congregations with such long histories, each on their own, prior to coming together, a few years as one is barely a moment. And yet these are such critical and life-giving moments right now. In saying yes to coming together, you said yes to a common language within which there are multiple dialects. And I don't think we would want a faith community to be anything different than that. And yet I must say, and it's perhaps because I am someone who cannot say I am either of Christ First or Christ Church, and I am neither nor of First United, my primary interest is in our shared new space as Christ First. I care about where you come from. I really do. But far more so, I care about who we are called to be for the present and future community that is within and then magnificently beyond these walls. With you, I am passionately committed to our shared identity as a united church, write that all lowercase, living our call within the United Church of Canada, building a safe space for all who might wonder if they even have a place anywhere with anyone. So if you'll indulge me with one story about how I came to know about Christ First long before I ever dreamed of being your new minister, I'll take you back to a moment. It was about late 2018, maybe early 2019. I don't remember that specifically, but I certainly know it was the Reverend Scott Beckett, who was still then student minister Scott Beckett, and he was serving in team with me at Trinity United in Beamsville. We were in a planning meeting, and somehow conversation led to Scott sharing about the process of selecting your new amalgamated name. He described a very democratic process of submissions and then whittling it down and selection and then voting. And I confess my very knee-jerk response was this unfiltered Phoebe Buffay-esque kind of, oh no. I had this vision of something going wrong with write-in ballots. And I said to Scott, that's how you end up with things like a Bodie McBoatface. And clearly that didn't happen. Clearly I needed to trust the process and to trust all of you. What you have ended up with, who you have ended up with, is each other as one church family. There are unique expressions within and beautiful, diverse stories of how you came to be here. But ultimately, the answer to the question of who is a singular gift. You are God's beloved. This is the name that defines you most and best. Just as Simon called Peter and Tabitha called Dorcas came together, not because of their names, but because of their shared identity, this church family is held in this common unity of God's extraordinary love. You are welcomed. You are held, strengthened, and sent in and by the power of God, who not just needs, but calls you and equips you to dream with grateful anticipation all over again. You are in the midst of your own rising to new life as an Easter people with a way of being that calls us to rise up against any suffering, any injustice, anything less than God-honoring love. This is a moment of naming for us all together, and it marks our new beginning. We are Christ First United Church. To God alone be the glory. Amen.